When I quiet the mind and open the record of the soul, I do not first see controversy. I see a woman standing at the foot of a cross, faithful when others fled. The Gospel of Mary became dangerous not because it invented scandal, but because it reminded the early church that authority is first a matter of inner awakening. It presents Mary Magdalene not merely as follower, but as confidant, interpreter, and at moments spiritual equal in understanding. A gospel that shifts salvation from external compliance to inward illumination was bound to trouble any system consolidating power. The question is not whether institutions are bad. The question is whether living truth can be fenced. What if the knowledge buried for centuries was silenced, not because it was false, but because it was too true, too luminous, too threatening to the fragile structures men were building? That is the question I feel when I touch the record of Mary Magdalene and the gospel that bears her name. A gospel many call dangerous, yet in truth it was only dangerous to those who sought control more than life. I see her standing at the foot of the cross while others scattered. I see her steady presence when despair was thick, and I see her eyes beholding the risen Christ before any other. And this woman was entrusted with the first proclamation of resurrection, but her voice was pressed down, her memory diluted, her authority muted. The text that carries her name rises like a whisper through time, telling of a Mary who was not merely a mourner nor merely a follower, but one who understood the Master's teaching at a level that unsettled the men beside her. In its fragments she is confidant, interpreter, and in some passages nearly equal in spiritual stature to the one she followed. Such a portrayal would always trouble a system intent on building rank and rule. For here salvation is not chained to rituals, councils, and decrees. It is not bound to law, as if law alone could set the soul free. Instead, it is shown as an awakening from ignorance, a lifting of the veil, a remembering of the divine origin within. The gospel speaks of sin not as an eternal stain, but as forgetfulness, and of redemption not as the payment of debt, but as the recovery of knowing. You can see why those shaping institutions would flinch. For if salvation springs from within, if the kingdom is revealed in the heart and not administered only at the altar, then authority cannot be hoarded. That is why I say this text is dangerous only to the proud, not to the seeker. The danger lies in its insistence that a woman was trusted above Peter, above John, with secret knowledge, that she rose in a circle of fear and gave comfort and clarity, that she was a teacher when others trembled. Imagine how that sounded in a culture built upon hierarchy, where voice and leadership were assumed to belong to men, where unity was preserved by excluding what did not fit. The Gospel of Mary cut across those lines. And so it was buried, silenced, labeled heresy, but the soul does not forget. When I rest in the current of truth, I hear her voice steady and calm. Do not grieve. Do not let fear bind you, for his grace will guide you. This is not the sound of rebellion. It is the sound of remembrance, the reminder that the Savior's work was not to create new chains, but to show souls how to walk free. You ask why a text would be hidden, why fragments alone would survive, and I tell you it is the way of human systems. To protect themselves, they deny what is larger than their own design, yet what is born of spirit cannot be erased. It endures in the undercurrents, in whispers and fragments, until the time comes again for listening. This is why in the late centuries it resurfaced, battered yet alive, carrying the echo of a Christianity that could have been, one in which leadership was measured not by office but by comprehension, not by title but by depth of heart. When I read these records, the struggle is plain: order versus inspiration, hierarchy versus illumination, fear versus knowledge, and in every age this same choice appears. I say to you, the text is not dangerous if you wish to live. It is dangerous only if you wish to rule. It does not dethrone Christ, it enthrones him more deeply in the soul. It does not abolish faith. It calls faith back to its root, to know what you are, to realize the divine spark placed within, to awaken from the ignorance that breeds sin. And as I speak these things, I feel again the tension in those early days. Peter unsettled by the thought that a woman might speak with greater clarity than himself, Levi defending her, the church slowly closing ranks, the voice of Mary pressed into silence. Yet the Spirit recorded it still, for nothing true is lost. The danger of this gospel is simply this: It removes the monopoly of salvation and gives it back to the soul. It affirms that truth is not the property of councils, but the inheritance of every child of the living Father. It says clearly that the kingdom is not postponed nor administered, but awakened. That is why it was banned, that is why it was hidden, and that is why its return matters. For it reminds us what was feared most, that God does. Sin is not an eternal stain carved upon the soul. Sin is ignorance, a forgetfulness of origin, a blindness that causes men and women to live as if they were only flesh and bone. And in the record of the Gospel of Mary, I see this teaching spelled out with clarity. For the Master told her plainly, there is no sin. It is you who create sin when you live according to ignorance. And what the text calls ignorance is the refusal to recognize the divine spark within, the refusal to see that the true self is not bound by corruption, but is joined to the incorruptible source. And when I rest in this truth, I know that salvation is not bought through external laws, not earned by endless ritual, but awakened by recognition, by knowledge of the self as a child of the living Father. In every age, men have built rules and called them holy. They have carved commandments in stone and then beaten each other with those stones, forgetting that law was given to guide the heart, not to replace it. And so the external became a cage, a means of control, a system where obedience was confused with life. But Mary's record cuts through this illusion and says, salvation is not a transaction, it is remembrance. I feel this when I touch the current of souls. For many come to me in the night burdened by guilt and fear, yet beneath that weight I see not filth but forgetfulness, not condemnation but confusion. And if I speak to them of their true nature, the light returns to their eyes. For knowledge brings freedom, awareness dissolves chains. Understand that knowledge here is not the accumulation of doctrines. It is not the cleverness of disputing teachers. It is Gnosis, inner knowing, the light of spirit awakening in the depths of consciousness. And when that light shines, the shadows of ignorance vanish, not because someone has paid off a debt, but because the lie of separation is dissolved. The early church feared this because a man who knows his origin cannot be ruled by threats. A woman who knows her true nature cannot be silenced by law, and a community that discovers the kingdom within cannot be controlled from without. That is why I say the Gospel of Mary was dangerous, for it tore the mask from fear and revealed that salvation is not mediated by priest or council, it is lived in the recognition of divine kinship. Yet let us not despise law, for order is needed in human affairs. Ritual can focus the mind, discipline can guard the path, but none of these should be mistaken for life itself. They are scaffolds, not the building. And when men worship the scaffold, they never enter the house. The text points us back to the living house, the temple not made with hands, the awareness of God within. And it insists that the true battle is fought not with swords or decrees, but with ignorance in the heart. When I look into the flow of time, I see how much blood was shed over laws, how many wars were justified in the name of sin. And yet the Master's voice still says, ignorance is the enemy. Awaken, and you will be free. Salvation, therefore, is a path of remembrance. It is the soul recalling its true nature. It is the heart rediscovering its source. And once this is known, conduct follows naturally, not out of fear of punishment, but out of alignment with truth. You do not need to threaten a man who knows he is light, for he will not choose darkness. You do not need to chain a woman who remembers she is child of God, for her steps will walk in harmony. The Gospel of Mary proclaims this with force, that the kingdom is not delayed nor owned by any institution. It is present in those who know, and knowing here means seeing through ignorance, discarding the lies of separation, living from the inner spark. This is why salvation from law to living knowledge is not rebellion but restoration. It is not the rejection of God's will, but the fulfillment of it. For the will of God is that his children remember him, not that they perish under endless guilt. I tell you plainly, if you would be free, you must know yourself, and in knowing yourself you will know the Father, and in knowing the Father you will live as one awakened, and that is salvation, not as transaction, but as transformation. Mary's voice was never the problem. The fear of her voice was, and I see it clearly in the record of those early days. For the men who fled at the cross could not bear that the one who remained was the one chosen to speak, to comfort, to lead, and when she rose among them after the resurrection to share the secret vision entrusted to her, some listened with wonder, while others recoiled, not because her words lacked truth, but because her authority upset the fragile order they were building. In the canonical writings, she is already extraordinary, present at the crucifixion when others hid, first at the tomb when others despaired, first to see and first to proclaim the risen one. But in the text that carries her name, the contrast grows sharper. She is not merely a witness, but a confidant, not merely a follower, but a teacher. And that is where the tension emerges. For her authority was rooted in comprehension, not in rank, in direct experience, not in inherited title. I can still hear the conversation unfold, the disciples grieving, fearful of persecution, unsure of their path, and she speaking words of strength. Do not grieve. Do not let fear bind you. His grace will protect you. And then unveiling the vision given to her, a map of the soul's journey, a teaching too deep for the crowd, but entrusted to her in intimacy. Yet Peter could not contain his discomfort. He questioned her legitimacy. He asked with sharpness, did the Savior really speak privately with a woman and not openly with us? Are we to turn and listen to her? And in those words you can feel the tremor of threatened authority. For if Mary's voice stood equal, what then became of his? Levi answered with courage, rebuking Peter. If the Savior made her worthy, who are you to reject her? Surely he knew her completely and loved her more than us. And with this defense, the record preserves not only a debate, but the unveiling of a pattern. For in every age, when spirit chooses a vessel outside the expected line, the guardians of order resist, and yet spirit defends its own. This is the fear of Mary's voice, that she could lead when others faltered, that she could teach when others doubted, that she could embody authority not given by men but by the Master himself. And this fear was strong enough to silence her, to push her story into whispers, to blur her identity into the image of a penitent sinner, to reduce her from leader to background. Yet the fragments of her gospel carry the echo that could not be erased. When I touch the flow of this memory, I sense the weight of human habit, how authority clings to patterns, how men imagine leadership must flow through rank and gender, yet spirit chooses otherwise. It chooses the willing heart, the clear mind, the vessel unafraid to stand in presence even when misunderstood. The fear of Mary's voice was the fear of disruption, for her words loosened the hold of external law. Her leadership loosened the hold of patriarchal order. Her knowledge loosened the hold of ignorance. And when all three are loosened, the structures of control tremble. Yet I say to you, her voice was never rebellion, it was remembrance. It was the continuation of the Master's teaching in its purest form, that the kingdom is within, that salvation is awakening, that authority belongs to comprehension, not to hierarchy. In every circle I have witnessed across ages, the same drama repeats. A voice rises from the margin, clear and steady, and those in power tighten their grip. But truth does not perish under suspicion, it only waits. And so Mary's voice waited, buried in fragments, hidden in deserts, carried forward until another time, when ears would open. The fear of her voice is the same fear men carry of their own inner knowing. For if each soul carries the spark, if each heart can awaken, then no man may rule absolutely, and institutions must bend to life rather than life bending to institutions. This is why the record of Mary remains vital. It shows us the clash between revelation and order, between spirit's free choice of vessel and man's insistence on lines of rank. And it shows us also the defense that there are always some, like Levi, who will stand to affirm what is true, even against the tide. I tell you plainly, if you would understand the gospel of Mary, you must hear the deeper conflict, not only man against woman, not only apostle against disciple, but fear against trust, order against insight, pride against humility. And the lesson remains that truth does not bow to fear. It waits until fear exhausts itself and then speaks again. Mary's voice was silenced in history, but not in the spirit. It still speaks. It still comforts. It still calls men and women to remember. and the fear that once tried to suppress it now serves only as a witness that her authority was real enough to unsettle, her clarity sharp enough to divide, her truth alive enough to endure. That is the true danger of her voice, that it could not be killed, and that even now it rises through time to be heard anew. The ascent of the soul is not a tale for poets alone, it is a map for travelers. And in the fragments of the Gospel of Mary, this journey is drawn with symbols that are more than symbols. They are the very gates every soul must pass. The text speaks of forces that rise to oppose the soul as it seeks return to its source, and these forces are named ignorance, desire, and wrath, each demanding that the soul remain bound to the material realm. Desire speaks first, claiming ownership, saying, "You belong to me, I saw you descend, I hold you now." And in that claim lies the bondage of appetite, the belief that the self is nothing more than its hungers and urges. Ignorance follows, whispering that the soul is dust, that nothing incorruptible lies within, and if believed, this voice extinguishes the memory of divinity. Wrath appears last, clothed in injury and vengeance, lashing out with the power of pain, binding the heart to endless cycles of reaction. Yet in the vision given to Mary, the soul answers each with authority, saying, "I know you. You are not my master. You belong to what perishes. I belong to what endures." And in that reply, the secret of freedom is revealed. The ascent is not an escape from the world. It is the reclaiming of mastery within the world. For ignorance cannot rule the soul that knows its origin. Desire cannot rule the soul that remembers its higher hunger. Wrath cannot rule the soul that rests in peace beyond offense. This journey is universal. It is not reserved for saints or mystics. Every man and woman walking the earth faces these same gatekeepers. Some meet them in death, but most meet them daily in the struggles of thought and choice. The Gospel of Mary gives a vision not for speculation, but for practice. It says plainly that salvation is the awakening of the soul to its divine origin, and that awakening is tested by these forces at every stage. When I rest in the current of the record, I feel how each soul rises in stages, first entangled by desire, then clouded by ignorance, then lashed by wrath, and only when it learns to answer with recognition does it ascend. This recognition is not pride, but memory. The soul does not boast, "I am greater." It simply remembers, "I am not yours. I belong to the incorruptible source," and that memory is the key. In practical life, this ascent is mirrored whenever a man refuses to be mastered by lust or greed, whenever a woman declines to accept the lie that she is unworthy, whenever a heart chooses forgiveness instead of vengeance. In those choices, the ascent is lived. The early church feared such teaching because it placed responsibility and authority directly into the hands of the individual soul, bypassing the mediating control of ritual and priesthood. For if each soul can ascend through knowledge and remembrance, then the structures of power have less claim. Yet this does not abolish the value of guides, teachers, or communities. It clarifies their purpose. They are companions, not masters, reminders, not rulers. For the soul's ascent is always personal, always direct, always between the inner self and the divine. I tell you, the ascent is real. It is not mere metaphor. It is the pattern woven into the very fabric of existence, the return of spirit to spirit. And the Gospel of Mary records it in the language of vision, because vision can carry what argument cannot. The fragmentary nature of the text leaves gaps, yet the essence is plain, that salvation is not a sudden gift bestowed arbitrarily, but a path walked, a recognition cultivated, an ignorance overcome, a desire transcended, a wrath dissolved. This does not diminish grace, for grace is the very power that sustains the soul in its struggle, but it reveals that grace is not imposed from without. It flows from within, and it is activated by recognition. The ascent of the soul is thus both a vision of the hereafter and a guide for the present, for those who remember now will ascend then, and those who awaken now will not be bound later. If you ask why such teaching was hidden, the answer is the same as before. It undermined control, it exalted the soul, it entrusted authority where men sought to restrict it. Yet here it is, preserved in whispers, reminding us that the path is already within us, the stage is already known, The force is already named, and the answer already given. Say to desire, you are not my master. Say to ignorance, I remember my origin. Say to wrath, I will not serve you. And in those words you will feel the ascent begin. The map is not complete in the fragments we possess, but the essential landmarks remain, and they are enough, for the spirit that inspired Mary's vision is the same spirit that inspires the soul today. The ascent is the great return, the rising of the divine spark through the fog of mortality, the triumph of remembrance over forgetting, the victory of light over shadow. It is not the rejection of the world, but the transformation of the one who walks within it, and it is open to all who are willing to know themselves as children of the living Father. That is the teaching preserved in the Gospel of Mary, and that is the map handed down to any soul ready to travel. A text is buried not because it is empty, but because it is too full. And the Gospel of Mary was pressed into shadow precisely because its vision overflowed. The narrow vessels men were preparing, for in the 2nd century the Church was shaping itself from scattered circles into a unified body, and unity required boundaries, creeds, councils, and clear lines of authority. Yet the words entrusted to Mary resisted those lines. They spoke of salvation as knowledge within. They lifted a woman to the seat of a teacher, and they diminished the need for external mediators, and that was intolerable to men who sought stability through control. When I touch the record, I feel their anxiety, for her voice contradicted their design. Her teaching undermined their rising hierarchy. Her authority embarrassed their patriarchy, and the simpler solution was silence. So the text was branded heretical, placed beyond the borders of Canon, and dismissed as Gnostic fantasy. Yet the fragments endured, because truth is stubborn and will not vanish when named forbidden. Understand this: Canon was not merely a spiritual act, it was political. It was the weaving of identity for a movement struggling to survive empire and division and to preserve cohesion. Leaders chose what agreed with their structures and excluded what might fracture them. I do not condemn them, for order was needed. Without form, the body scatters. Without law, the flame flickers. But I know also that in their zeal for order, they buried treasures, and among those treasures was Mary's gospel. It is the way of human institutions to protect themselves. They imagine that by narrowing the stream, they can keep it pure. But living water resists. It seeps through cracks. It carves new channels. And the suppressed text did not perish. It whispered in hidden places until time ripened again. The Gospel of Mary was buried because it shifted authority from the outer to the inner, because it entrusted revelation to a woman, because it taught that sin was ignorance and redemption remembrance, because it dared to say the soul rises by knowledge, not by ritual alone, and in doing so it weakened the hand of those who would govern salvation. The care for unity became the excuse for suppression, and so what could have been a wider, richer Christianity narrowed into lines that favored uniformity. Yet I say there is wisdom in this story, for it shows both the necessity of order and the danger of rigidity. Unity without diversity becomes brittle, and diversity without unity becomes chaos. The balance was missed, and the Gospel of Mary was cast aside. I can still feel the weight of bishops debating which text to preserve, anxious to exclude what might divide, yet forgetting that spirit thrives in diversity, that the Master himself spoke differently to crowds, to disciples, to friends, to women, and to men, tailoring the word to the heart that could receive it. In burying Mary's voice, they thought to protect the flock, but in truth they silenced part of the shepherd's message. The record teaches us that suppression is never the final word. What is of life returns, what is born of spirit endures, and so in time the fragments reappeared, enough to remind us that early Christianity was far more diverse than we were taught, that women carried authority, that mystics preserved visions, that salvation was preached not only as obedience but as awakening. The act of burial tells us as much as the words themselves. It reveals the priorities of the age. It shows us what threatened power. It unmasks the fear beneath the councils. And it cautions us now not to repeat the same mistake. When institutions cling too tightly to control, they crush the very life they mean to guard. When leaders silence voices that do not fit, they may win order, but they lose truth, and the Spirit waits patiently until another season when ears are ready. The Gospel of Mary is proof that what is buried is not destroyed. The fragments still speak, the record still breathes, and the questions it raised then remain vital now. Who holds authority? What is sin? Where does salvation dwell? Is truth entrusted only to rank, or to every soul that awakens? These questions disturbed the second century, and they disturb still, for the struggle between canon and freedom, between control and inspiration, between law and spirit, is never finished. I say to you, a text gets buried when it threatens pride, when it undermines power, when it refuses to bend to structures, and yet in that burial it often gains greater witness, for when unearthed it shines as treasure recovered, truth vindicated. The Gospel of Mary was silenced to preserve order, but the Spirit preserved it to preserve life, and so it returns, not to overthrow order, but to remind order of its limits. That is why it matters that we remember, that we read the buried text with discernment, not swallowing every word untested, but weighing them against the fruits of Spirit, asking if they awaken love, if they bring freedom, if they honor the Christ pattern, and if they do, then their burial was a mistake of men, not of God. The story of Mary's Gospel is the story of how human fear meets divine revelation, and how fear buries but revelation survives. And it teaches us to guard against the same impulse in ourselves, to listen for the voices we might silence, to open to the truths we might suppress. For what is of spirit cannot be killed. It only waits for resurrection. The rediscovery of the Gospel of Mary was not an accident of dust and parchment. It was the return of a voice that had refused silence. And in the closing years of the 19th century, when fragments appeared in a Coptic codex, the world was reminded that truth, once buried, still breathes. For the manuscript was incomplete, torn, missing whole sections, yet enough remained to reveal the shape of a teaching that challenged history. And not long after, two Greek fragments surfaced, earlier in origin, confirming that this was no isolated curiosity, but a text once read more widely. Scholars debated its age, its authorship, its authenticity, but what mattered most was not the certainty of who wrote it, but the unmistakable presence of a theology that emphasized inner knowledge, the authority of Mary, and a vision of the soul's ascent. These fragments did not prove every claim, but they proved something greater, that the early Christian world was never a single stream. It was a river braided with many currents, and among those currents was one where a woman carried profound authority. When I rest in the current of the record, I feel the weight of that rediscovery, for it is as though a long-buried seed sprouted again in a more receptive soil, and what could not flourish in the second century returned in the modern age, where questions of gender, authority, and spiritual independence have once more become urgent. The fragments are broken, but even in their incompleteness they speak loudly, and perhaps their brokenness itself is a sign, for truth is often received in pieces, leaving gaps that force the seeker to lean upon spirit for completion. Some lament the missing pages, but I say their absence is also instruction, for it compels humility. It demands that no scholar nor seeker claim absolute possession of meaning. It keeps alive the reality that revelation is always larger than its fragments. The witness of these fragments is threefold. First, they witness that Mary was remembered not only as a follower, but as a leader and teacher. Second, they witness that salvation was presented as awakening rather than legal transaction. Third, they witness that the diversity of early Christianity was greater than later structures allowed. This is not speculation. It is inscribed in the text that remains. And though the papyrus is fragile, the message is strong. The discovery itself shook assumptions. For centuries, many believed the canon to be not only authoritative but exhaustive, yet here was proof that other gospels existed, carrying different emphases, different visions, and though suppressed, they endured long enough to return. Some feared this would undermine faith. I say it refines faith, for faith built only on the illusion of uniformity is brittle, while faith that embraces the breadth of spirit is strong. The fragments prove that the Spirit moves in many vessels, not only in those later chosen for the canon, and they prove that even when councils exclude, the divine record includes preserving what men discard. To read the Gospel of Mary is to remember that Christianity was once a conversation, not merely a decree, and that conversation included women, mystics, and visions that startled the order of the day. I tell you, the rediscovery is itself a parable. For just as Mary was silenced and later vindicated, so too her gospel was buried and later raised, showing that truth follows the pattern of resurrection, descending into shadow only to rise in light. This is why I call the fragments witnesses, for they testify that suppression is not destruction, they testify that diversity is not disorder, they testify that the Spirit writes across centuries and refuses erasure. When you hold in mind the broken leaves of that codex, imagine not only the scholars piecing together lines of faded ink, but also the unseen hands of Spirit carrying that text through fire, flood, decay, and indifference, preserving enough for the message to be heard again. The fragments are more than history. They are prophecy fulfilled, for they prove that what is true will return when the time is ready. Some look only at what is missing. I look at what remains. And what remains is enough to awaken questions, enough to stir hearts, enough to remind us that salvation is inward, that authority is spiritual, that women, too, were entrusted with revelation. That is the testimony of these fragile pages, and that is why their rediscovery was not simply academic, it was spiritual, for it confronted the church and the seeker alike with the reality that the story is wider than we thought, the canon narrower than the truth, and the voice of Mary still speaking, though long suppressed. The fragments prove that the Spirit will not be silenced, that revelation can be delayed but not destroyed, that what was dangerous to power is still nourishing to souls, and that the wisdom of Mary belongs not to the past only but to the present. I say plainly, the rediscovery of the Gospel of Mary is itself a gospel. The good news that truth survives burial, that voices silenced still echo, that fragments are enough when Spirit fills the gaps, and that no authority of men can cancel the authority of God. That is what the fragments proved, and that is why they matter. The relevance of the Gospel of Mary is not confined to the dust of ancient manuscripts. It speaks directly to the unrest of the modern soul. For in every generation, people seek freedom from structures that have grown heavy, and in every heart there is a hunger for direct connection with the divine. And the fragments that survived answer this hunger with clarity. They say the kingdom is within. They say sin is ignorance. They say authority belongs to comprehension, not to office, and these truths cut across centuries with the same sharpness as when first spoken. Look at the present world, restless with disillusionment. Many leave the churches not because they hate Christ, but because they cannot find life within rigid forms. Many search in meditation, psychology, or esoteric paths because they long for what ritual alone has not given. And the voice of Mary addresses them plainly. It says, "Do not despise the outer, but do not mistake it for the source. Turn inward, awaken to the spark, discover God where he always dwells, in the silence of your own soul." The modern age is filled with noise, with technologies that distract, with endless comparisons, with pressures to conform, and in that noise the Gospel of Mary offers a counterpoint, the practice of remembrance, the courage to know oneself as child of the living Father, the authority to resist fear, desire, ignorance, and wrath in daily life. For women, her gospel holds special relevance. It reclaims the truth that spiritual authority is not bound by gender, that revelation is not confined to men, that leadership flows from insight and love, and this is a message sorely needed in an age still wrestling with equality. For men, her gospel holds equal challenge. It calls them to release the fear of losing rank, to embrace humility, to recognize that truth is not threatened by the elevation of another, but completed by it. And this is a healing desperately needed in a world fractured by domination. In communities of faith, the relevance is sharp, for the text shows that authority must serve life, not stifle it, that councils and rituals have meaning only when they lead souls to awakening, not when they replace it. and this lesson could renew institutions if they would listen. For the seeker outside tradition, the relevance is also clear. It warns against pride in private spirituality. It reminds that inner knowledge must always bear fruit in love, that Gnosis is not for boasting but for service, that remembering God within must always express in compassion without, and this guards the path from distortion. The Gospel of Mary speaks to the individual by affirming the responsibility each carries. Salvation is not passive. It is not waiting for external decree. It is awakening. It is choosing light over shadow. It is recognizing origin and destiny. And this is profoundly liberating, but also profoundly demanding, for it leaves no room for excuses. The text is relevant to the social world as well, for it shows that suppressed voices eventually rise, that those silenced by fear return in power, and this resonates with every movement for justice, with every cry of the marginalized, with every effort to restore dignity to those erased by history. The story of Mary's Gospel is the story of survival of truth under pressure, and this mirrors the struggles of countless groups today who fight to have their truth acknowledged, their voice heard, their worth affirmed. The modern soul needs this reminder that suppression is not final, that what is buried returns, that life itself is persistent, that spirit cannot be erased, and this brings hope in times of oppression. On the deepest level, the relevance of the Gospel of Mary is existential, for it reframes the human condition, not as guilt before an angry judge, but as ignorance before a forgotten origin. And this shifts the path from fear to remembrance, from punishment to awakening, from despair to hope. And in a time when depression, anxiety, and confusion afflict multitudes, this teaching can bring healing. For it says, "You are not condemned, you are only asleep, and you may awaken." The text calls us to practice daily, to meet desire and say, "You are not my master," to meet ignorance and say, "I remember my origin," to meet wrath and say, "I will not be bound." And this practice is timeless. It works as truly now as it did then. I tell you, the relevance of Mary's Gospel is not academic. It is living. It is the medicine the modern soul longs for. It is the reminder that authority lies in comprehension, that the kingdom is present, that salvation is awakening, and that truth survives burial. The fragments that endured survived for this reason, to speak again in a time ready to hear, and their message is this, that you need not wait for permission to awaken, you need only to remember who you are. A teaching is not true because it is old, nor false because it was once forbidden. It must be tested in the soul. And this is the final lesson the Gospel of Mary presses upon me, that discernment belongs not to councils or hierarchies alone, but to every awakened heart. For the Spirit is placed within you as the lamp by which to read any text, and without that lamp even Canon can be misused. With that lamp, even fragments can give life. The question is not whether the Gospel of Mary should stand beside Matthew or John. The question is whether its words bear the fruits of Spirit, whether they quicken love, whether they release fear, whether they awaken remembrance of origin, and if they do, then they are true, for truth is known by its fruits. I have seen many souls trapped by superstition, fearing that to touch what is called heretical is to invite ruin. But I say the greater danger is to let fear replace discernment, for fear blinds while discernment sees, and the spirit within you is not a spirit of fear but of clarity. If the gospel entrusted to Mary calls you inward to know the Father, if it strengthens you to resist desire, ignorance, and wrath, if it humbles you into love of neighbor, then it is working the same pattern as all true revelation, and its banning was the act of men, not of God. But if any teaching, whether canon or fragment, stirs pride, contempt, cruelty, or despair, then it is not truth for you, for the Christ pattern is the measure, and by that pattern all is weighed. This is the practice of discernment, to ask not only what is said, but what it does, to test the spirit by its fruits, to let the inner witness confirm or deny, and this practice is the safeguard against deception. The final relevance of the Gospel of Mary is therefore not only in its content, but in its challenge. It forces you to awaken the faculty of discernment, to stop leaning blindly on external authority, to recognize that you carry the Spirit's witness within. That is the very awakening it preaches. Some will say this is dangerous, that without strict external rule, chaos will follow. But I tell you, the greater chaos is born of blind obedience. The greater danger is when men surrender conscience to counsels and forget that God's voice still speaks in the quiet heart. The banning of Mary's gospel is a warning. It shows us how fear of disruption leads to suppression. It reminds us that institutions may silence truth for a season, and it proves that Spirit always restores what is essential, even in fragments, even in whispers, even after centuries. The deeper lesson is to guard against the same impulse in ourselves. For every man and woman carries within both Peter and Mary the impulse to doubt the unexpected voice and the capacity to receive it, and each day we choose which we will serve. When an insight arises within, do we question it because it comes through an unlikely vessel, or do we test it by its fruits? This is the practice, and this is how we avoid repeating the errors of history. I tell you plainly, the Spirit is not bound by gender, by title, by canon. It speaks where it wills, and the wise soul learns to recognize its sound, whether from pulpit or desert, from text or dream, from man or woman, from canon or fragment. The conclusion then is not despair that truth was buried, but hope that truth cannot be killed. It always rises, and the rediscovery of the Gospel of Mary proves it, for her voice is still heard, her teaching still stirs, her vision still awakens, and the very fact that you read it now is evidence that Spirit's work continues. The residue it leaves is a deeper courage, a clearer sense of responsibility, for no longer can you say, I was not told. You have been reminded that salvation is awakening, that authority is comprehension, that the kingdom is within, and that discernment is your sacred duty. Carry this into life. Test every teaching by its fruits. Hold fast to what awakens love and freedom. Release what binds with fear or pride. And remember always that the Christ pattern is simple. Love God, love neighbor, forgive, serve, awaken. If the Gospel of Mary leads you deeper into that pattern, then it is true for you, and its banning is irrelevant. If it does not, then let it rest without fear. This is the balance of spirit. This is the maturity of faith. And this is the enduring lesson of Mary's forbidden gospel. The echoes of her voice remind us that truth is larger than institutions, that revelation is freer than counsels, that the soul is more luminous than laws, and that even fragments can contain fire. Let this fire warm you, not to destroy, but to illumine. Let it guide you to live awake, to remember, to love. For in the end, no ban can silence the Spirit, and no ignorance can hold the soul that knows its origin. This is the final word, not of controversy, but of certainty, that what is of God endures, and what is born of fear fades, and the soul that remembers its source walks free, forever free.